My name is Tasha. I am 28 years old, and I am the founder of Luxe Horizon, Atlanta's premier public relations and luxury event firm. But before I built my empire, I was just a woman trying to prove my worth to a family that viewed me as a disposable asset. The sterile chill of Doctor Harrison Wallace's high-end Buckhead clinic was meant to feel exclusive. Instead, it felt like an execution chamber. There were no lengthy explanations, no gentle warm-ups. The doctor simply slid a thick cream-colored folder across his massive mahogany desk. He folded his hands and delivered the verdict with the practiced apathy of a man who dealt in bad news daily. He told me my test results were definitive. Premature ovarian failure. The egg reserve of a woman decades older than my 26 years. 0% chance of conceiving a child naturally. I remember the ringing in my ears. I remember staring at the gold lettering on the doctor's nameplate waiting for the punchline. But what I remember most vividly was the physical sensation of my fiancé, DeAndre Sterling, pulling his hand away from mine. He did not squeeze my fingers in support. He did not offer a shoulder for me to cry on. He recoiled. He pulled his hand back and wiped his palm against his tailored slacks, as if my infertility was something he could catch. DeAndre was the golden child of the Sterling family. His father, Bishop Calvin Sterling, ran a sprawling mega-church empire that felt more like a Fortune 500 company than a place of worship. The Sterlings were Atlanta royalty. They lived in gated mansions, drove imported luxury cars, and expected perfection from everyone in their orbit. I had spent 3 years twisting myself into knots to fit their mold. I attended every Sunday service, organized their high-profile charity galas for free, and smiled through their constant passive-aggressive comments about my working-class background. I thought my loyalty would eventually earn their respect. I was painfully naive. The silence in the doctor's office was suffocating. I looked at DeAndre, waiting for him to say that we would figure this out, that we could explore other options, that his love for me was bigger than a medical diagnosis. Instead, he stood up. He smoothed the wrinkles from his designer suit jacket, cleared his throat, and looked at the doctor. He asked if there was any margin of error. Dr. Wallace shook his head and confirmed the results were absolute. DeAndre nodded once, turned his back to me, and walked out of the office without saying a single word. I chased after him. I hurried through the luxurious waiting room, ignoring the sympathetic glances of the receptionists. I caught up to him in the private parking garage. The relentless heat of the Georgia sun hit me like a physical blow, but it was nothing compared to the coldness in DeAndre's eyes when he finally turned to face me beside his black Bentley. He did not reach for me. He stood leaning against his expensive car, checking his gold watch as if I were a business meeting running over its allotted time. The man I had shared a home with, the man who had promised to love me through sickness and health, looked at me with pure calculation. I asked him why he walked out. I asked him what we were going to do. DeAndre let out a heavy sigh, the kind a parent uses with a stubborn child. He told me there was no we anymore. He said the Sterling family legacy required biological heirs. He reminded me that his father's congregation expected him to present a perfect traditional family, to take over the ministry one day. A dead branch on the family tree was simply unacceptable for their brand. I stood there on the hot asphalt, struggling to comprehend how 3 years of love could be erased in 3 minutes. I reminded him of our plans, of the life we had built. DeAndre laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. He told me I was being overly emotional. He said I should be practical about the situation. And then he looked down at my left hand. He told me he needed the ring back. The sheer audacity of his request paralyzed me for a moment. He was not just breaking my heart, he was repossessing the collateral. I looked at the flawless 3-carat diamond on my finger. It had always felt too heavy, a constant reminder of the expectations I carried as a future Sterling wife. Without shedding a single tear, I pulled the ring off my finger. I did not throw it. I did not scream. I placed it carefully into his outstretched palm. I told him he was a coward who would never be half the man his father pretended to be. I turned around, ordered a black car on my phone, and left him standing there in the parking lot. The ride back to our shared Buckhead estate was a blur. My mind was racing, trying to process the magnitude of the betrayal. But I knew I could not afford to fall apart. I needed to pack my things and get out of their house before DeAndre returned. I thought I would have a few hours of quiet to collect my belongings. I was wrong. The Sterlings had already mobilized. When I walked through the massive double doors of the mansion, I found Bishop Calvin Sterling sitting in the formal living room. He was wearing his signature tailored suit, swirling a glass of premium bourbon. It was barely 2 in the afternoon, but the bishop rarely adhered to the holy rules he preached to his congregation. He looked up as I entered, a smirk playing on his lips. He already knew. DeAndre must have called him the second I got into my car. The bishop did not offer condolences. He took a slow sip of his bourbon and set the glass down on a marble coaster. He told me to pack my bags quickly. He said he had never approved of me, that I was a worthless peasant who had managed to trick his son with a pretty face and a modest public relations business. He admitted they had only tolerated me because they thought my rising company could eventually generate good press for their ministry. But now, he sneered, I lacked the basic biological function of a woman. I stood my ground. I refused to let this hypocrite see me break. I told him my worth was not determined by my womb or his approval. I reminded him that my public relations firm had single-handedly saved his church from 3 separate media scandals last year. I told him his entire empire was built on smoke and mirrors, and that his arrogance would be his ultimate undoing. Bishop Calvin laughed, a booming theatrical sound that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. He stood up, adjusting his expensive cufflinks. He warned me not to threaten men who wielded real power. He said I was leaving with nothing, just the cheap clothes I came with, and that nobody in Atlanta would ever hire my firm again once he spread the word that I was unstable. He called me a barren, broken woman who had outlived her usefulness. Before I could deliver a response, the sharp clatter of heels on hardwood caught my attention. Kendra Sterling. DeAndre's younger sister marched down the grand staircase. For 2 years, Kendra had called me her sister. We had shopped together, traveled together, and shared secrets. I had planned her lavish 25th birthday party entirely for free. Now, she was dragging my 2 designer suitcases down the stairs, letting them bounce violently against the steps. Kendra stopped at the bottom, crossed her arms, and looked at me with undisguised contempt. She told me to take my trash and get out of her family's house. She did not stop there. Kendra always loved twisting the knife. With a malicious smile, she revealed that she had never liked me. Even worse, she bragged that she had already introduced DeAndre to someone else a month ago. Someone from a proper family. Her name was Sabrina Davenport. Sabrina was the daughter of a billionaire real estate mogul who regularly funded the bishop's church projects. Kendra proudly announced that Sabrina was everything I could never be: wealthy, connected, and most importantly capable of providing the Sterlings with a proper heir. The betrayal was absolute. The entire family had been plotting my replacement while I was busy planning their charity events and mapping out my future with DeAndre. They expected me to break down. They wanted tears, begging, and hysterics to validate their belief that I was weak. I denied them that satisfaction. I picked up my suitcases. I pulled the secondary black credit card DeAndre had given me from my wallet and flicked it onto the marble floor. I looked directly into Bishop Calvin's eyes, then at Kendra's smug face. I told them they were a family of hollow, miserable frauds. I promised them that I would build an empire so massive it would cast a permanent shadow over their pathetic little church. I warned them that the day would come when they would beg for my mercy, and on that day, I would offer them none. I turned my back on the Sterling family, walked out of the massive front doors, and stepped into the humid Atlanta air. I did not shed a single tear. The sadness was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, sharp determination. They had tried to destroy me, but all they had done was set me free. The Uber ride back to the sprawling Buckhead estate I shared with Donovan was a silent, suffocating blur. My mind raced uncontrollably, frantically trying to process the sheer magnitude of the betrayal I had just endured in that sweltering parking lot. But deep down, beneath the crushing layers of sudden grief and profound shock, a brand new survival instinct was already taking root. I knew I could not afford the luxury of falling apart. I needed to return to that mansion, pack my belongings with absolute dignity, and get out of their toxic environment before Donovan returned to spin his own twisted version of the narrative. I foolishly believed I would have a few quiet, solitary hours to collect my things in peace. I was incredibly wrong. The Sterling family machine was ruthlessly efficient, and they had already mobilized their forces to ensure my exit was as painful and degrading as possible. The real confrontation was not the one I left behind at the medical clinic, but the one waiting for me behind the heavy oak doors of the mansion. As the massive iron gates of the Sterling estate swung open to admit my hired car, I took a deep, stabilizing breath. I smoothed the fabric of my skirt and checked my reflection in the dark screen of my phone. I would not let them see me broken. I would not grant them the satisfaction of my tears. The golden child had run away, but I was about to walk straight into the lion's den. I paid the driver, grabbed my purse, and marched up the pristine stone steps. I turned my key in the lock for what I knew would be the final time. When I walked through the grand double doors of the mansion, I immediately sensed that I was not alone. I found Bishop Calvin Sterling sitting dead center in the formal living room. He was wearing his signature tailored charcoal suit, casually swirling a glass of premium bourbon over a single sphere of ice. It was barely 2 in the afternoon, but the bishop rarely adhered to the holy rules he so aggressively preached to his congregation every Sunday. He looked up as I entered, a cold, calculating smirk playing on his lips. He already knew. Donovan must have called him the very second I got into my car. The bishop did not stand to greet me. He did not offer any semblance of sympathy or pastoral comfort for the devastating medical news I had just received. He took a slow sip of his bourbon and set the crystal glass down heavily on a marble coaster. He looked me up and down, his eyes filled with unfiltered disdain. He told me I needed to pack my bags quickly and quietly. His voice echoed off the vaulted ceilings as he stated that he had never actually approved of me. He called me a barren, worthless peasant who had managed to temporarily trick his son with a pretty face and modest public relations business. The cruelty in his words was entirely intentional. He openly admitted that the Sterling family had only tolerated my presence because they mistakenly believed my rising company could eventually generate free positive press for their ministry and help fund Donovan and his lavish lifestyle. But now, he sneered, leaning forward in his plush armchair, the situation had fundamentally changed. He made it agonizingly clear that without a functioning womb, I was utterly useless to the Sterling brand. He said a woman who could not produce a biological heir was a defective liability. They simply could not afford to keep on the payroll. I stood my ground in the center of the room. I refused to let this arrogant hypocrite see me shatter. I looked directly into his eyes and told him my worth was not determined by my reproductive organs or his conditional approval. I reminded him firmly that my public relations firm had single-handedly saved his church from 3 separate highly damaging media scandals over the past year alone. I told him his entire religious empire was built on fragile smoke and mirrors, and that his immense arrogance would ultimately be his permanent undoing. Bishop Calvin laughed. It was a booming theatrical sound designed to make me feel small. He stood up slowly, adjusting his expensive gold cufflinks with practiced arrogance. He warned me never to threaten men who wielded real, tangible power in this city. He declared that I was leaving his property with absolutely nothing, just the cheap clothes I came with. He promised that nobody in Atlanta would ever hire my firm again once he personally spread the word that I was mentally unstable and emotionally volatile. He called me a broken woman who had permanently outlived her usefulness to his family. Before I could deliver a response to his hollow threats, a sharp, aggressive clatter of heels on hardwood caught my attention. Dominique Sterling Donovan and his snobby younger sister marched down the grand staircase. For 2 long years, Dominique had falsely called me her sister. We had shopped together, traveled together, and shared intimate secrets. I had planned and executed her lavish 25th birthday party entirely for free, working around the clock to ensure she looked like royalty. Now she was forcefully dragging my 2 designer suitcases down the stairs, deliberately letting them bounce violently and loudly against the pristine wooden steps. Dominique stopped at the bottom, landing, crossed her arms tightly over her chest, and looked at me with undisguised contempt. She kicked one of my bags toward my feet and told me to take my trash and get out of her family house immediately. But Dominique never stopped at simple insults. She had always loved twisting the knife to inflict maximum damage. With a malicious, triumphant smile, she casually revealed a secret that made my blood run cold. She proudly announced that she had never actually liked me, and even worse, she bragged that she already had my permanent replacement perfectly lined up for Donovan. Her name, Dominique stated with pure venom, was Brianna Davenport. Brianna was a wealthy, well-connected heiress, and the spoiled daughter of a billionaire real estate mogul who regularly funded the bishop and his expensive church projects. Dominique happily confessed that she had introduced Donovan to Brianna over a month ago. A full month before my devastating medical diagnosis. My fiancé and his family were already actively auditioning my replacement. Dominique proudly declared that Brianna was absolutely everything I could never be: wealthy, elite, highly connected, and most importantly, fully capable of providing the Sterlings with a proper, acceptable heir. The betrayal was so absolute and comprehensive that it temporarily stole the oxygen from my lungs. The entire family had been actively plotting my replacement behind my back while I was busy planning their charity events and mapping out my future with the man I loved. They fully expected me to break down in that living room. They wanted tears, begging, and pathetic hysterics to validate their cruel belief that I was weak and dependent. They wanted me to confirm their narrative that I was nothing without the prestigious Sterling name attached to mine. I deliberately denied them that satisfaction. I took a deep, steadying breath and completely ignored the mocking grin. I calmly walked over to the sleek marble console table positioned near the front entrance. I reached into my purse, retrieved the heavy set of house keys that had once represented my future, and placed them gently onto the cold stone surface. The soft metallic clink echoed clearly through the tense silence of the grand foyer. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of fear. I turned to face Bishop Calvin, who was watching me with a mixture of annoyance and surprise. I looked at the powerful man who believed he could dictate my worth, and then I shifted my gaze to his smug, entitled daughter. I told them both that they were a family of hollow, miserable frauds who hid their ugly truths behind expensive suits and religious titles. I promised them with a quiet intensity that finally wiped the smile off the snobby face that I would build an empire so massive and undeniable that it would cast a permanent, suffocating shadow over their pathetic church. I warned them that the day would inevitably come when they would beg for my mercy. And on that day, I assured them I would offer none. I gripped the handles of my suitcases, I turned my back on the Sterling dynasty, walked out the doors, and stepped into the Atlanta afternoon. I did not shed one single tear. The sadness was gone, replaced by cold determination. They tried to destroy me, but they only set me free. My transformation had begun. I would never again allow anyone to dictate my value. I was finally the sole author of my own true and absolute destiny. 30 days. That was how long it took to channel the devastating humiliation of my brutal eviction into pure ambition. I did not waste a single hour crying over DeAndre or the toxic Sterling family. Instead, I poured every ounce of my shattered heart and burning rage into Luxe Horizon. I worked 90-hour weeks, fueled by black coffee and a relentless drive to build an empire that would eventually force them to their knees. My public relations and luxury event firm was no longer just a business. It was my weapon. I aggressively expanded my client roster, strategically poaching 3 major corporate accounts that had previously belonged to the Sterling megachurch network. Bishop Calvin tried to block my local vendor access, but my flawless industry reputation easily bypassed his petty sabotage. I operated with a cold, calculated precision that left my competitors scrambling to keep up. By the end of that first month, I had secured a highly coveted meeting with the most powerful board of elite investors in Atlanta. They were a wealthy syndicate of venture capitalists looking for a fresh, visionary firm to manage their entire portfolio of high society galas, charity balls, and corporate summits. Landing this massive contract would instantly elevate Luxe Horizon from a successful boutique agency to an untouchable corporate powerhouse. It was the exact level of elite prestige the Sterlings had always claimed I could never achieve without their sacred family name. I walked into the sleek glass-walled boardroom on the 50th floor of the Midtown Tower, wearing a sharp crimson suit that projected absolute authority. I felt untouchable, completely in control of my own destiny. But my body was hiding a massive, universe-altering secret, one that was about to violently derail my perfectly orchestrated presentation. I stood at the head of the expansive mahogany conference table, effortlessly commanding the attention of 12 influential investors. My pitch was flawless. I detailed my aggressive expansion strategy, projected our quarterly returns with razor-sharp accuracy, and outlined a revolutionary marketing approach that had the entire room nodding in enthusiastic agreement. I was entirely in my element, dominating the corporate space with the kind of fierce, undeniable confidence that only comes from having absolutely nothing left to lose. But about 20 minutes into the intense presentation, a strange, suffocating heat began to crawl up the back of my neck. The bright fluorescent lights above the conference table suddenly seemed blindingly harsh, burning into my retinas. I paused mid-sentence to take a sip of ice water, desperately hoping to clear the sudden thick fog rolling into my brain. It did not help. The sleek leather chairs, the serious faces of the investors, and the towering glass windows showcasing the Atlanta skyline began to blur and tilt at a sickening angle. A wave of intense, crushing dizziness hit me so hard that my knees actually buckled beneath the expensive fabric of my suit. I tried to grip the edge of the heavy wooden podium to steady myself, but my fingers felt entirely numb and completely disconnected from my brain. The sharp, confident voice I had been using to command the room reduced to a faint, breathless whisper that I could barely hear. I remember seeing the lead investor suddenly stand up from his chair, his face shifting rapidly from polite professional interest to genuine medical alarm. He shouted my name, but the panicked sound seemed to come from deep underwater. My vision went completely black at the edges. The polished hardwood floor rushed up to meet me, and then the world faded into absolute terrifying darkness. I drifted back to consciousness, surrounded by the rhythmic, steady beeping of a clinical heart monitor. The harsh boardroom lights had been replaced by the soft, muted glow of a private hospital room. I blinked against the sterile white ceiling, a dull, throbbing ache settling behind my eyes, as the terrifying memory of my public corporate collapse came rushing back. I tried to sit up, frantically calculating the immense damage to my professional reputation, but a gentle hand pressed lightly against my shoulder. A tall, warm-faced emergency room doctor with kind brown eyes stepped into my immediate line of vision. His name tag read Dr. Evans. His calm demeanor was a jarring, profound contrast to the chilling, calculated apathy I had experienced with Doctor Harrison Wallace just 1 month prior. Dr. Evans offered a reassuring smile and instructed me to stay perfectly still while my blood pressure stabilized. He explained that I had been brought in by ambulance after suffering a severe fainting spell during my presentation. I immediately started apologizing to him, rambling anxiously about my intense work schedule, the 90-hour work weeks, and my excessive daily caffeine intake. I assumed I had simply pushed my body past its physical limits due to the sheer stress of expanding Luxe Horizon without a safety net. Dr. Evans chuckled softly, a warm sound that immediately put my racing heart at ease. He reviewed the digital medical tablet in his hand and agreed that extreme stress and severe exhaustion were certainly contributing factors to my sudden collapse. However, he stated clearly, they were not the primary biological cause of my dramatic medical episode. He looked down at me with a bright, congratulatory smile and announced that the fainting spell was actually a very common, perfectly natural physical reaction given my current condition. He casually folded his arms and stated that I was exactly 7 weeks pregnant. The word hung in the quiet hospital room, echoing off the sterile walls like a heavy physical blow. Pregnant. I stared at Dr. Evans, my mind completely incapable of processing the life-altering information he had just delivered with such cheerful certainty. I told him he absolutely had to be looking at the wrong medical chart. I explained, my voice trembling with rising panic, that a pregnancy was biologically impossible for me. I quickly recounted my agonizing visit to Dr. Wallace's elite Buckhead fertility clinic just 30 short days ago. I detailed the devastating, life-ruining diagnosis of premature ovarian failure and the absolute heartbreaking certainty that my egg reserve was completely depleted. I told Dr. Evans that Atlanta's top specialist had looked me dead in the eye and guaranteed I had zero chance of ever conceiving a child naturally. Dr. Evans immediately stopped smiling. His professional demeanor shifted rapidly from warm congratulations to deep concentrated medical confusion. He pulled up my comprehensive blood work and abdominal ultrasound results on the large monitor mounted beside my hospital bed. He turned the screen toward me, pointing directly to a small, undeniable flutter of life pulsing steadily in the dark center of the image. He told me the visual evidence was absolute and could not be debated. He gently explained that he had run a secondary reproductive hormone panel when I arrived at the emergency room, just as a standard precaution for any woman of childbearing age presenting with syncope. He stated with unwavering medical authority that my reproductive health was absolutely flawless. My hormone levels were completely perfect, my organ function was pristine, and my body was currently nurturing a healthy, thriving 7-week-old fetus. There was absolutely no trace of premature ovarian failure, no depleted egg reserve, and no biological defect whatsoever. I did the mental math instantly. 7 weeks meant this child was conceived directly before DeAndre and his father threw me out of their mansion. The crushing, chilling realization hit me with the destructive force of a runaway freight train. Doctor Harrison Wallace, the highly respected specialist, the man who had effectively ended my engagement and handed the Sterling family the perfect excuse to discard me, had deliberately lied to my face. I lay back against the stiff hospital pillows as the pieces of the puzzle began to violently snap together in my mind. This was never about a tragic medical misfortune. This was a highly coordinated, expensive assassination of my future. Dr. Wallace had not made a simple clinical error. A specialist of his elite caliber did not accidentally mistake a perfectly healthy 26-year-old woman for someone entering early menopause. He had intentionally falsified my medical records. He had fabricated a devastating diagnosis specifically designed to break my spirit and justify DeAndre's immediate callous departure. The Sterling family had needed a pristine, socially acceptable reason to break our long-standing engagement without tarnishing their precious mega-church brand. They could not afford the public scandal of simply abandoning a loyal fiancé, so they medically branded me as defective merchandise. My 2 hands instinctively moved to gently rest over my lower stomach, protecting the tiny impossible miracle growing inside me. They thought I would quietly disappear into the background, too broken to ever challenge their immense power. Instead, they had unknowingly handed me the ultimate weapon to engineer their complete destruction. And I was going to use it to orchestrate their absolute, highly public ruin. I walked out of that hospital a completely different woman than the one who had collapsed in the boardroom. The crippling anxiety that had plagued me for the past month was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. I did not shed a single tear of relief or joy over my pregnancy. I knew that any display of typical maternal emotion would be a dangerous distraction from the mission at hand. I placed my hands over my stomach one final time in the privacy of the hospital elevator, making a silent promise to the child growing inside me. I promised that nobody from the Sterling bloodline would ever have the opportunity to make them feel disposable, to ensure that I needed absolute, irrefutable proof of their conspiracy. I needed ammunition that could withstand the scrutiny of the elite legal teams I knew Bishop Calvin kept on his payroll. I could not simply march up to their sprawling Buckhead estate and demand answers. That would be a rookie mistake, a purely emotional reaction that would only give them time to cover their tracks and destroy the evidence. I needed a professional. Within an hour of my discharge, I contacted Marcus Vance, the most ruthless and discreet private investigator in Atlanta. Marcus was a former federal agent who specialized in corporate espionage and high-wealth divorce cases. I was not cheap, but my public relations firm was generating more than enough revenue to cover his exorbitant retainer. We met in a dimly lit, soundproof conference room at my office later that same evening. I slid a thick file across the table containing Dr. Harrison Wallace's clinic information, Bishop Calvin's church details, and the timeline of my abrupt medical-based eviction from the Sterling family. I told Marcus I needed to know exactly how deep the corruption ran. I gave him unrestricted access to my own medical records and told him to follow the money, no matter where it led or who it implicated. The waiting period was an agonizing test of my newly forged discipline. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to expose them immediately, to leak the truth of my pregnancy to the local press, and watch the Sterling family scramble to protect their precious manufactured reputation. But I knew patience was the ultimate weapon in this psychological war. While Marcus delved into the dark, hidden underbelly of the megachurch empire, I maintained an impenetrable facade of focused professionalism. I finalized the massive contract with the venture capitalist syndicate, officially securing Vanguard Elite's position as the top luxury firm in the city. I smiled through high-profile networking dinners, shaking hands with the same elite socialites who actively attended Bishop Calvin's Sunday services. Several of them offered me false, pitying smiles, whispering behind their manicured hands about how tragic it was that I had been cast aside so abruptly by Atlanta's favorite son. I simply smiled back, graciously accepting their hollow sympathy while secretly cataloging every single person who had blindly bought into the Sterling family's fabricated narrative. I was meticulously building a fortress of success around myself, ensuring that when the inevitable explosion finally occurred, my professional standing would remain completely untouched. I spent my evenings alone in my luxury apartment, researching corporate holding structures and blind trusts, preparing the financial cage. I planned to drop directly over the bishop's head. I was a woman operating on pure, unadulterated vengeance disguised as corporate ambition. 10 days after I hired him, Marcus called me on my secure encrypted line and requested an immediate in-person meeting. He arrived at my apartment just after midnight carrying a heavy encrypted hard drive and wearing an expression of grim professional satisfaction. He connected his device to my living room monitor and began to unravel a conspiracy so sickeningly corrupt it almost defied belief. Marcus had started by digging into the personal history between Doctor Harrison Wallace and Bishop Calvin Sterling. The sterile, highly respected fertility doctor and the charismatic, supposedly righteous religious leader were not just casual acquaintances or passing golfing buddies. They were former college fraternity brothers who had maintained a deeply entangled, highly secretive financial relationship spanning over 3 decades. Marcus displayed a complex web of offshore banking transfers, shell corporations, and hidden limited liability companies. For years, Bishop Calvin had been funneling untaxed tax-exempt church donations directly into Dr. Wallace's private luxury real estate investments under the guise of anonymous philanthropic grants. They were bound together by millions of dollars of embezzled money. This financial chokehold meant that the bishop essentially owned the doctor. When Calvin needed a sudden, catastrophic medical diagnosis to surgically remove me from his son's life, Dr. Wallace was more than willing to compromise his Hippocratic oath to protect his own lucrative illegal revenue streams. But the financial corruption was merely the prologue to the true horror of their deception. Marcus clicked to the next slide, bringing up a series of highly classified, heavily encrypted medical records that he had managed to extract directly from the clinic's raw, unedited database. These were not the forged, heavily redacted files Dr. Wallace had handed me across his mahogany desk. These were the original, unaltered laboratory reports detailing the actual fertility tests conducted on both me and my former fiancé. I stared at the bright screen, my heart pounding a furious rhythm against my ribs as Marcus highlighted the critical sections. The medical data proved unequivocally that my reproductive health had always been entirely flawless. I was never the problem. The devastating, catastrophic failure belonged entirely to Donovan. According to the genuine pathology reports, Donovan suffered from a severe, aggressively deteriorating genetic reproductive condition. His sperm count had been plummeting for years, rapidly approaching absolute, irreversible sterility. Bishop Calvin had received this disastrous medical news weeks before my appointment. The bishop understood instantly that his golden child, the highly publicized future heir to the Sterling megachurch empire, was biologically incapable of continuing their sacred bloodline. In the hyper-masculine, deeply traditional world of their elite religious community, a man's inability to produce a biological heir was viewed as a profound, shameful weakness. Bishop Calvin had spent decades cultivating an untouchable alpha image for his family, preaching sermons about male dominance, traditional family values, and the divine right of the Sterling legacy. He could not and would not allow his congregation to know that his only son was biologically defective. To protect Donovan's incredibly fragile ego and shield the family's manufactured reputation from public humiliation, Calvin orchestrated a ruthless deception. He paid Dr. Wallace a staggering sum of embezzled church funds to completely swap our medical diagnoses. They fabricated the premature ovarian failure results, projecting Donovan's severe medical inadequacy directly onto me. They branded me as the barren, broken woman, turning me into a convenient disposable scapegoat. They allowed me to carry the agonizing burden of infertility, watching me weep in the parking lot, all while knowing with absolute certainty that I was perfectly healthy. The sheer, calculated cruelty of their actions took my breath away. They had stolen my peace of mind, shattered my sense of self-worth, and violently ejected me from my own home, all to protect the fragile pride of a weak, cowardly man. As I processed the sickening depth of their medical betrayal, Marcus delivered the final, most crucial piece of the puzzle. The malicious medical swap was not motivated by ego alone. It was driven by sheer, desperate financial terror. Marcus pulled up the internal accounting ledgers for the Sterling megachurch documents that were strictly hidden from the congregation's trusting eyes. The glorious, untouchable religious empire was actually crumbling from within. Decades of Calvin's reckless spending, lavish real estate purchases, and gross financial mismanagement had left the church drowning in tens of millions of dollars of hidden debt. The sprawling Buckhead estate, the private jets, the imported cars, everything was heavily mortgaged and dangerously close to imminent foreclosure. Bishop Calvin was standing on the absolute brink of total bankruptcy and highly public ruin. He needed a massive immediate influx of untraceable capital to save his crumbling empire from federal auditors. I was a successful self-made woman, but my rising public relations firm simply did not possess the kind of staggering liquid generational wealth required to bail out a sinking megachurch. I was a financial dead end for the bishop. But Brianna Davenport, the snobby entitled heiress that Donovan's sister had so proudly paraded as my replacement, was a completely different story. Brianna's father was a ruthless billionaire real estate mogul who had long sought to align his secular business empire with the untouchable social influence of the Sterling Church. A marriage between Donovan and Brianna would bring a massive multi-million-dollar dowry disguised as a charitable church donation, instantly wiping out Calvin's crippling debts and securing the family's luxurious lifestyle. But Calvin knew that the Davenport family demanded a biological heir to solidify the lucrative union. Brianna was desperate to marry into the prestigious Sterling name, and Calvin knew he had to lock down the marriage before Donovan's rapidly deteriorating fertility became absolute permanent sterility. They needed me gone immediately, but they needed to discard me in a way that left Donovan looking like a tragic, sympathetic victim rather than a callous villain. By framing me as the barren, defective partner, Donovan gained the perfect, socially acceptable excuse to end our engagement. He could publicly play the role of the heartbroken man who simply had to prioritize his family's sacred legacy while secretly rushing to impregnate the billionaire's daughter before his biological clock permanently expired. It was a masterclass in narcissistic manipulation, financial extortion, and absolute moral bankruptcy. I sat in the quiet glow of the computer monitor, staring at the irrefutable evidence of their conspiracy, the documents, the bank transfers, the original pathology reports. It was all there, perfectly cataloged and legally obtained by my investigator. I now possessed the exact ammunition required to obliterate the Sterling dynasty from the face of Atlanta's elite society. I paid Marcus his substantial bonus, locked the encrypted hard drive in my fireproof wall safe, and poured myself a glass of sparkling water. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows of my luxury apartment, gazing out at the glittering lights of the city skyline. Bishop Calvin believed he had successfully buried me beneath the crushing weight of a false medical diagnosis. I thought his secrets were permanently safe, locked away behind his powerful pastoral collar and his stolen wealth. He had absolutely no idea that the discarded, supposedly worthless peasant was currently holding the match that would soon burn his entire fraudulent empire to the ground. The brilliant attorney I retained Richard Cole sat across from me the following morning and vehemently urged me to file a massive medical malpractice lawsuit against Dr. Wallace. Richard was a ruthless shark in the courtroom, and his eyes practically gleamed as he reviewed the falsified pathology reports. He promised me we could easily extract tens of millions of dollars from the corrupt fertility clinic and permanently revoke the doctor's medical license. He argued that exposing the fraudulent diagnosis would immediately publicly humiliate Bishop Calvin and completely destroy the Sterling family's carefully crafted reputation before Donovan even had the chance to marry his billionaire heiress. It was a highly tempting proposition. The thought of watching the bishop being dragged out of his sprawling mega-church in handcuffs was intensely satisfying. But I sharply raised my hand and told Richard to close the file. I refused to let my thirst for immediate revenge blind me to the long-term reality of my situation. I placed my hands firmly over my stomach and explained the terrifying legal vulnerability I currently faced. If I filed a high-profile lawsuit against Dr. Wallace right now, the explosive medical discovery process would instantly alert the Sterling family to the fact that I was pregnant with Donovan's biological child. Bishop Calvin was currently drowning in secret financial debt, but he still possessed immense dangerous social power within the Atlanta judicial system. More importantly, Donovan was irreversibly sterile. My unborn child was the absolute last, impossible chance for the Sterling bloodline to survive. If they discovered my pregnancy before I secured my legal boundaries, they would unleash a merciless army of corporate lawyers to violently rip my baby away from me. They would tie me up in suffocating custody battles for decades, using the billionaire Davenport family wealth to drain my resources and paint me as an unfit, vindictive mother. I could not risk my child becoming a captive pawn in their twisted religious dynasty. I needed to sever them completely legally and permanently before they ever found out my baby existed. I instructed Richard to pivot our entire legal strategy. We were not going to the press, and we were not filing a lawsuit. We were going to execute a hostile, invisible corporate takeover. My private investigator, Marcus, had already mapped out the exact layout of Bishop Calvin's crippling financial debts. The cornerstone of the bishop's impending bankruptcy was a massive, highly toxic piece of commercial real estate located in downtown Atlanta. Calvin had purchased the sprawling 40-acre plot years ago using embezzled church funds, aggressively planning to build an extravagant secondary worship center. Instead, the property had become a colossal financial sinkhole draining millions of dollars in taxes and maintenance fees every single quarter. Marcus confirmed that if the bishop did not secure a massive all-cash buyer for that specific property within the next 3 weeks, the federal banks would initiate foreclosure. A public foreclosure would immediately trigger an aggressive audit of the church's hidden financial ledgers, thereby exposing Calvin's embezzlement and permanently ruining Donovan's highly lucrative marriage to Brianna Davenport. The Sterlings were bleeding out, and they were completely desperate for a financial savior. I gladly decided to play that role wearing a flawless corporate mask. I utilized the massive capital I had recently generated through Vanguard Elite to quietly establish a completely blind, heavily fortified shell corporation named Apex Holdings. I intentionally registered the corporate entity in Delaware to guarantee absolute impenetrable anonymity. Once the corporate shield was firmly in place, I instructed my legal team to approach Bishop Calvin's desperate financial brokers with an incredibly aggressive all-cash offer for his failing downtown commercial property. I deliberately priced the buyout offer just slightly above the current market value, making it an absolute irresistible lifeline for a man drowning in severe debt. But my generous offer came with a singular, non-negotiable condition. The Sterlings had to close the deal and sign the massive stack of transfer documents within exactly 10 business days. Bishop Calvin took the bait with the desperate, blinded greed of a starving man. His brokers frantically agreed to the expedited timeline, completely unaware that their frantic rush was the central mechanism of my trap. They were so intensely focused on securing the multi-million-dollar cash injection to save their crumbling church that they completely neglected to properly scrutinize the buyer. The next phase of my plan required absolute legal precision. I sat down with Richard in my office and directed him to draft the official commercial real estate buyout contract. It was a massive, towering document, intentionally bloated to over 150 pages of dense mind-numbing corporate jargon and complex property liabilities. But buried deep within Section 84, under a deceptively boring heading labeled Comprehensive Liability and Legacy Waivers, we inserted a fatal, irreversible legal poison pill. The clause was a masterpiece of hidden legal warfare. It explicitly stated that by accepting the multi-million-dollar payout, the sellers officially listed as Bishop Calvin Sterling and Donovan Sterling agreed to permanently, unconditionally, and irrevocably relinquish any and all paternal, familial, and financial rights to any past, present, or future biological anomalies, offspring, or descendants associated with the purchasing entity, its subsidiaries, or its past affiliates. The language was meticulously crafted to sound like a standard corporate protection clause shielding the buyer from future liability claims. To a rushed, careless reader, it simply looked like legal boilerplate meant to protect the real estate holding company. But functionally, because I was the sole owner of the purchasing entity, that specific paragraph constituted a complete legally binding termination of their parental rights to my unborn child. I read over the final draft of the contract 3 times, feeling a cold, powerful thrill coursing through my veins. The trap was perfectly set. If Donovan and his father signed that specific document, they would legally sell away their only biological heir for the price of a commercial real estate bailout. The morning of the official closing arrived with a heavy, humid downpour over the city of Atlanta. I did not attend the final signing in person. My physical presence would immediately shatter the blind corporate illusion and trigger their alarm. Instead, I remained seated in my sleek penthouse office at Vanguard Elite, sipping a warm cup of herbal tea while watching the closing room proceedings through a secure encrypted live video feed provided by my lead attorney. On the screen, Bishop Calvin and Donovan strutted into the upscale downtown law firm looking incredibly smug and deeply relieved. They wore perfectly tailored designer suits and carried themselves with the arrogant, untouchable swagger of men who believed they had just successfully outsmarted the universe. Donovan was casually texting on his phone, likely planning the final lavish details of his upcoming wedding to the Davenport heiress. Bishop Calvin was loudly bragging to his brokers about how the Lord always provided for his faithful servants at the final hour. They had absolutely no idea they were walking directly into a slaughterhouse. My attorney, Richard, maintained a chilling, flawless poker face as he presented the towering stack of commercial real estate contracts. He calmly explained the expedited nature of the all-cash wire transfer, verbally highlighting the massive financial payout waiting in the escrow account. The bishop's eyes practically glowed with raw, unfiltered greed when he saw the final dollar amount printed on the top page. Richard politely offered them the opportunity to have their own legal counsel review the 150 pages before signing. He warned them that the contract contained highly complex liability waivers. It was the perfect psychological manipulation. Richard knew that telling arrogant, narcissistic men to slow down and read the rules only made them want to rush the process to prove their own dominance. Bishop Calvin scoffed loudly, waving away the suggestion with his heavy gold-ringed hand. He declared that his own lawyers were too slow and that he fully understood how standard commercial real estate transfers operated. I was so terrified of losing the massive life-saving cash bailout that he refused to delay the transaction by a single hour. Donovan barely even glanced at the thick stack of papers. He was entirely focused on the fact that this money would finally secure his wealthy bride and permanently solidify his alpha status within the church. I sat in my quiet office, my heart pounding a steady, victorious rhythm as I watched the live feed. I watched Bishop Calvin confidently pull a gold fountain pen from his breast pocket. I watched him casually flip to the back of the massive document, completely bypassing the fatal paragraph buried in Section 84. I watched him sign his name with a heavy, arrogant flourish. I then handed the pen to his son. Donovan took the pen, smiled a hollow, charming smile at the room, and scrawled his signature directly beneath his father's. The heavy thud of Richard's notary stamp echoed through the computer speakers, confirming the absolute finality of their action. The wire transfer was immediately initiated, and the funds moved smoothly from my shell corporation directly into the bishop's starving church accounts. The Sterlings stood up, shook hands with my legal team, and strutted out of the conference room, completely oblivious to the catastrophic reality of what they had just done. My phone buzzed on my desk. It was a simple one-word text message from Richard. Done. I leaned back in my leather chair and let out a long, shuddering breath. I pressed my hand against my stomach, feeling an overwhelming wave of fierce protective triumph wash over me. The Sterling family had just traded away their sacred, highly coveted bloodline for a piece of downtown real estate. They had legally permanently severed themselves from my child, locking themselves out of our lives forever. My baby was entirely mine, fully protected by an ironclad, irreversible legal wall. I had successfully executed a silent, flawless checkmate. The golden child and the powerful bishop were now securely trapped in my web, happily spending my money to fund a fraudulent wedding and save a dying church. They thought they had survived their financial crisis. They thought they had successfully discarded me. They had no idea that their absolute, highly public devastation was already scheduled, and I was holding the ultimate invitation. 2 years evaporated into the rearview mirror, replaced by the towering, undeniable reality of my absolute success. I had completely transformed Vanguard Elite into the undisputed, untouchable crown jewel of Atlanta's luxury public relations and event management scene. We dictated the social calendar of the entire city. If a high-profile charity gala, an elite corporate summit, or a multi-million-dollar high society wedding did not have the official Vanguard Elite stamp of approval, it was considered entirely irrelevant by the city's ruthless power players. I commanded staggering 7-figure retainers and carefully curated exclusive guest lists that possessed the power to instantly make or break a wealthy family's fragile social standing. I had ruthlessly clawed my way to the top of the corporate hierarchy, securing my position as the undisputed queen of the Atlanta elite. I moved through boardrooms and luxury ballrooms with the chilling, calculated grace of a woman who had been dragged through the fire and emerged utterly fireproof. But my greatest, most profound achievement was not my skyrocketing bank account or my flawless corporate reputation. My greatest masterpiece was currently asleep in his custom-designed nursery inside my sprawling penthouse, blissfully unaware of the massive empire his mother was fiercely building for his future. Cairo was 18 months old, a perfectly healthy, brilliantly sharp toddler who possessed my relentless energy and, somewhat ironically, Donovan's exact physical features. He had the same deep, expressive brown eyes, the same distinct structured jawline, and the same arrogant little smirk that the Sterling men were so famously known for. Every single time I looked at my son, I felt an overwhelming wave of fierce predatory love wash over me. I kept Cairo strictly shielded from the public eye, completely hidden from the toxic, gossiping Atlanta socialite scene. He was my closely guarded treasure, my entire world, and my ultimate devastating secret weapon. The Sterlings had spent the last 24 months blissfully spending my bailout money, entirely convinced they had successfully erased me from their elite existence. They were living on borrowed time, dancing blindly on the edge of a cliff I had personally carved for them. It was a crisp, beautifully clear Tuesday afternoon when the universe decided to randomly test my legendary composure. I was currently enjoying a highly exclusive private shopping appointment at Maison de Leon, an impossibly chic, ultra-luxury boutique nestled deep in the heart of the wealthy Buckhead shopping district. The store catered strictly to Atlanta's highest tax brackets, offering imported European silks, custom-tailored evening wear, and a level of absolute privacy that local billionaires and celebrities actively demanded. I was comfortably seated in the plush velvet-lined VIP fitting area, sipping a glass of complimentary imported sparkling water. I was carefully evaluating a stunning custom-designed crimson gown for an upcoming charity gala. The boutique manager, a sharp-eyed, impeccably dressed Frenchwoman named Vivienne, was personally attending to me, fluttering around the spacious dressing room with various diamonds to match the garment. The serene, perfectly curated atmosphere of the luxury boutique was suddenly shattered by the sharp, obnoxious clatter of designer heels and loud, aggressively entitled laughter. I did not even need to turn my head to identify the source of the disruption. The high-pitched, grating voice of Dominique Sterling cut through the quiet, refined elegance of the store like a screeching fire alarm. I casually peered through the sheer shimmering privacy curtains of my VIP fitting area. Dominique was marching through the main showroom like she owned the building, holding up a delicate, heavily beaded silk dress and complaining loudly about the price tag to the woman walking beside her. That woman was Brianna Davenport. She was draped from head to toe in flashy, oversized designer logos, completely desperate to ensure everyone in the immediate vicinity knew exactly how wealthy her billionaire real estate father was. She was also noticeably heavily pregnant, rubbing her 5-month belly with an exaggerated, highly theatrical motion deliberately designed to draw maximum public attention. I watched them interact for a brief, calculating moment, observing the pathetic, purely transactional nature of their friendship. Dominique was actively playing the role of the subservient court jester, aggressively hyping up the pregnant heiress, who was currently financing her brother's fragile ego and saving her family's dying church. I stepped out of the VIP fitting area, my posture immaculate, projecting the kind of effortless, terrifying authority that new money could simply never buy. Dominique spotted me instantly. Her fake practice smile vanished, replaced by a sudden ugly sneer of recognition. She aggressively nudged Brianna, pointing a manicured acrylic finger directly in my direction. Instead of retreating from the awkward encounter, the two women marched directly toward my private section of the boutique, their eyes alight with the malicious, toxic thrill of an unexpected confrontation. They were practically salivating at the opportunity to kick me while they assumed I was still down. Dominique crossed her arms tightly over her chest, looking me up and down with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. She loudly announced to the entire boutique that she could not believe management allowed common barren ex-girlfriends to shop in such exclusive establishments. She laughed maliciously, clearly trying to perform for her wealthy future sister-in-law. Brianna let out a cruel hyena-like laugh, stepping forward to ensure I had a clear, unobstructed view of her protruding stomach. She introduced herself with dripping condescension, proudly declaring that she was Donovan's beautiful future wife and the mother of the only legitimate sterling heir. Brianna sneered, her heavily contoured face twisting into an ugly mask of superiority. She told me it was a terrible shame I could never give Donovan what he actually needed to be a real man. She bragged loudly, her voice carrying clearly across the silent, breathless boutique about their upcoming multi-million-dollar wedding. She boasted that her billionaire father had spared absolutely no expense booking the most exclusive, expensive venue in the entire state of Georgia to celebrate their perfect high society union. She actively wanted to ensure I felt the full crushing weight of my supposed failure. She called me a lonely, defective woman who would spend the rest of her pathetic life crying and watching another better woman live out my stolen dream. I listened to her desperate, vicious monologue with absolute chilling tranquility. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not offer them the hysterical, broken reaction they so desperately craved. I stood perfectly still, letting their toxic, deeply insecure energy bounce harmlessly off my titanium armor. I looked directly at Brianna's rounded stomach, fully knowing the absolute catastrophic medical truth that she was entirely blind to. I knew the sterile, irreversible reality hidden inside Donovan's medical files, securely locked in my office safe. I simply smiled, a cold, razor-sharp smile that made Dominique take an involuntary nervous step backward. The sheer power of my silence clearly unnerved them, disrupting the narrative they had created in their heads. I turned my attention entirely away from them, completely dismissing their pathetic existence, and subtly signaled for the boutique manager. Vivian rushed over immediately, her posture rigid with deep professional anxiety over the escalating disruption in her store. I reached into my custom designer purse and pulled out my heavy, solid metal black American Express card. I held it casually between two manicured fingers and instructed Vivian in a smooth, carrying tone that I wanted to purchase the entire new seasonal collection. I specified, locking eyes with a suddenly pale Dominique, that I wanted every single piece of luxury inventory currently displayed on the floor, including the exact silk dresses Dominique and Brianna were currently holding in their hands. I told Vivian to pack it all up, put it on my tab, and have it delivered directly to my penthouse by evening. Then I casually handed her the black card and politely requested that she and her security team immediately escort the loud, disruptive window shoppers out of my private fitting area. I stated loud enough for the other high-end patrons to hear that I preferred to conduct my luxury shopping in absolute peace, entirely free from the grating noise of desperate, insecure women who could not actually afford to buy anything in the store. Vivienne did not hesitate for a single second. My immense purchasing power commanded her absolute unwavering loyalty. She snapped her fingers efficiently, immediately summoning two massive suited security guards from the front entrance of the boutique. Dominique and Brianna were completely paralyzed by shock, their mouths hanging open in sheer, unadulterated disbelief as the reality of my financial dominance washed over them. The security guards politely but firmly grasped their elbows, guiding them forcefully toward the front exit. Brianna instantly started screaming hysterically about her billionaire father threatening to buy the entire building and have every single employee fired on the spot, but her frantic, entitled threats fell on completely deaf ears. Dominique sputtered in absolute humiliation, her face burning red as the other wealthy shoppers stared at them with blatant disgust. I stood gracefully in the center of the pristine boutique, calmly sipping my sparkling water, and watched through the expansive floor-to-ceiling front windows as the two women were unceremoniously deposited onto the hot Buckhead sidewalk. They stood there fuming, humiliated, and completely powerless against the financial fortress I had successfully built. They genuinely thought they had won the war by securing a fraudulent marriage and a fake heir. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that they were just blindly playing a rigged game, stepping right into the crosshairs of a trap I had meticulously set 2 years ago. I finished my water, admiring my reflection in the mirror, knowing the countdown to their total destruction had officially begun. Exactly 7 days after I watched Dominique and Brianna being forcefully escorted out of that high-end Buckhead boutique, a private courier arrived at the top floor of the Vanguard Elite headquarters. I was seated behind my custom marble desk, finalizing the quarterly projections for my newest corporate clients, when my executive assistant knocked softly on the glass door. She stepped into my office carrying a heavy, oversized black velvet envelope that had been delivered directly to my private corporate address. The envelope was sealed with thick metallic gold wax, and pressed firmly into the center of that wax was the unmistakable, ostentatious crest of the Sterling family. I dismissed my assistant with a polite nod and stared at the dark envelope resting on my pristine desk. The sheer breathtaking arrogance of sending this directly to my place of business was a classic Bishop Calvin intimidation tactic. He wanted to invade my professional sanctuary and remind me of the immense social power he believed he still wielded over my life. I picked up a silver letter opener and smoothly sliced through the heavy gold wax seal. I slid the contents out onto my desk. The wedding invitation itself was an obnoxious display of new money desperation, featuring thick triple-ply ivory cardstock, excessive gold foil embossing, and elegant calligraphy that boldly announced the upcoming holy union of Donovan Sterling and Brianna Davenport. But it was not the lavish, overly expensive invitation that caught my immediate attention. It was the heavy cream-colored piece of personalized stationery that fell out and landed face down on my desk. I flipped it over. The note was handwritten in the sharp, aggressive, slanted penmanship that I instantly recognized as belonging to Bishop Calvin Sterling himself. I read the words slowly, letting the profound, toxic cruelty of his message wash over me. He had written, "You are invited to witness what a true, complete woman looks like. Come see Donovan marry into a family that can actually secure the Sterling legacy." I sat back in my plush leather chair and read the vicious handwritten note a second time. Any ordinary woman might have shattered right there in her office. Any other woman who had been brutally discarded, falsely diagnosed with premature ovarian failure, and replaced by a pregnant billionaire heiress, would have crumbled under the suffocating weight of that specific targeted humiliation. The bishop actively wanted to destroy my psychological foundation. He wanted me to sit alone in my office weeping over my supposedly barren womb while I imagined his son standing at the altar with a highly fertile, wealthy bride. He wanted to crush my spirit so entirely that I would never dare to show my face in elite Atlanta society again. He genuinely believed his cruel, handwritten note was the final devastating nail in my coffin. I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel a single ounce of pain. Instead, I felt a deep, resonant surge of pure, unadulterated power. Bishop Calvin was not writing from a place of unshakable confidence. He was writing from a place of deeply rooted, frantic insecurity. He needed to rub this fraudulent marriage in my face, because he was desperately trying to convince himself that his crumbling megachurch empire was finally safe. He was projecting a desperate illusion of strength to mask the terrifying reality of his financial ruin. I gently traced my finger over the heavy gold foil of the main invitation, scanning the intricate calligraphy to find the exact logistical details of their upcoming high society spectacle. My eyes scanned past the date, which was scheduled for exactly 3 weeks from today. My eyes scanned past the requested black tie dress code, and then my gaze locked firmly onto the designated venue for both the holy ceremony and the opulent evening reception. The words were printed in large, elegant gold letters, the Sovereign Grand Hotel. I stared at the name of the venue. The air in my expansive office suddenly felt completely still. For a long, silent moment, I simply looked at those 4 printed words. And then a slow, dark, victorious laugh bubbled up from the very bottom of my chest, echoing brightly against the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my penthouse office. I laughed until I actually had to wipe a tear of pure, magnificent joy from the corner of my eye. The sheer poetic justice of the universe was so profoundly beautiful it almost defied human logic. The Sovereign Grand Hotel was widely considered the absolute pinnacle of luxury and historic prestige in the entire city of Atlanta. It boasted crystal chandeliers, imported marble floors, sweeping grand ballrooms, and a reputation for hosting only the most elite billionaire-class events in the state. It was exactly the kind of flashy, obscenely expensive venue the Sterling family would desperately choose to publicly mask their secret financial bankruptcy and project a false image of unlimited wealth. But there was a massive, catastrophic detail that Bishop Calvin and Donovan Sterling were completely hopelessly blind to. The Sovereign Grand Hotel was no longer an independent luxury entity. Exactly 48 hours prior to this invitation arriving on my desk, my primary parent corporation, Apex Holdings, had successfully finalized a massive, aggressive, all-cash corporate acquisition of the Sovereign Grand Hotel. I owned it. I owned the grand ballrooms, I owned the pristine white silk aisles, I owned the catering contracts, and I owned the very ground they were planning to stand on to pledge their fraudulent vows. They had deliberately sent me a spiteful, mocking invitation to rub their triumphant wedding in my face, completely oblivious to the fact that they had just unknowingly booked their entire lavish celebration inside my own house. I stopped laughing and immediately shifted into a state of cold, tactical execution. I picked up my secure office phone and pressed the direct extension for Elias, my brilliant, highly discreet chief operating officer. Elias answered on this first ring, his tone sharp and ready for instruction. I informed him that the Sterling and Davenport wedding was officially booked in the main diamond ballroom of the Sovereign Grand Hotel for the upcoming month. Elias, who was intimately aware of my catastrophic history with the Sterling family and the true nature of my strategic acquisitions, immediately asked if I wanted his legal team to quietly cancel their reservation and refund their massive deposit. He assumed I would want to deny them the prestige of utilizing our newly acquired luxury property. I told Elias absolutely not. I instructed him that under no circumstances were we going to cancel their reservation or give them any reason to suspect a change in the hotel's corporate ownership. I wanted the Sterling family to feel incredibly comfortable, wildly powerful, and entirely untouchable, right up until the very last second. I gave Elias a series of highly specific, uncompromising directives. I ordered him to personally contact the general manager of the Sovereign Grand Hotel and instruct the entire hospitality staff to treat the Sterling and Davenport families like absolute, unrivaled royalty. If Brianna Davenport demanded custom imported orchids from overseas, I wanted the hotel to source them immediately. If Bishop Calvin requested the most expensive, highly exclusive vintage champagne available in our underground cellars for the reception toast, I wanted the staff to pop the corks without a moment of hesitation. I wanted our concierge team to proactively offer them complimentary upgrades to the presidential suites. I wanted every single employee to bow their heads and deliver an absolutely flawless 5-star luxury experience that would make the Sterlings feel like they were the undisputed kings and queens of Atlanta society. Elias listened carefully, his silence on the other end of the line indicating his deep understanding of my strategy. I explained that we needed them to aggressively rack up their massive catering tabs, lock in their non-refundable vendor contracts, and invite every single powerful, influential megachurch elder and wealthy socialite in their vast network. I wanted the room packed to the absolute maximum capacity with the most important, judgmental, and highly connected people in the state of Georgia. I needed the audience for their downfall to be as large and prestigious as humanly possible. The Sterlings believed they had successfully outsmarted me. They genuinely thought they had traded a barren, worthless peasant for a highly fertile billionaire heiress who would permanently secure their fragile legacy and save their dying church. They were relying on this multi-million-dollar spectacle at the Sovereign Grand Hotel to publicly cement their ultimate victory. They were strutting blindly into a highly fortified, beautifully decorated cage that I had personally designed for them. I told Elias to monitor their event planning daily and to ensure that absolutely nothing interrupted their blissful, arrogant ignorance. Let them smile for the cameras. Let them boast to the press about their perfect holy union. Let them stand proudly at the altar surrounded by thousands of imported white roses and blinding crystal chandeliers. I wanted them to reach the absolute, dizzying peak of their social and financial triumph. Because the higher they climbed up that glittering pedestal, the more devastating the impact would be when they finally hit the concrete floor. I ended the call with Elias feeling a profound, unshakable sense of calm radiating through my entire body. I picked up Bishop Calvin's hateful handwritten note from my desk. "You are invited to witness what a true, complete woman looks like." I read the words one final time before smoothly dropping the heavy cardstock directly into my office paper shredder. I watched the sharp metal blades effortlessly slice his arrogant words into 100 meaningless tiny white ribbons. Bishop Calvin had requested my presence to witness his ultimate triumph. I fully intended to RSVP, yes, but I would not be arriving as the broken, weeping, discarded ex-fiancé hiding in the shadows of the back row. I would be arriving as the undisputed owner of the building, the architect of their financial ruin, and the fiercely protective mother of the only true Sterling heir in existence. The stage was perfectly set, the trap was fully loaded and primed. I stood up from my desk, smoothed the pristine fabric of my designer skirt, and walked out of my office to prepare for the most satisfying explosive event of the decade. The Sterling family wanted a spectacular, unforgettable show, and I was going specifically to pull the plug. The Sovereign Grand Hotel had been transformed into a suffocating display of stolen wealth and desperate vanity. I stood completely hidden in the velvet-draped shadows of the second-floor mezzanine, looking down at the magnificent diamond ballroom. The Sterling family had spared absolutely no expense, enthusiastically burning through the millions of dollars I had covertly wired them just 2 years prior. Thousands of imported white orchids and rare white roses cascaded from the vaulted ceilings, hanging heavily over the crystal chandeliers. The sheer volume of flowers infused the air with a sickly sweet perfume that felt more appropriate for an opulent funeral than a holy matrimony. The guest list was a perfectly curated collection of Atlanta elite. Sitting in the plush front rows were billionaire real estate developers, influential local politicians, and the deeply judgmental, highly conservative elders of Bishop Calvin megachurch. These were the exact same people who had blindly swallowed the false narrative of my supposed infertility. They sat in their custom-tailored suits and expensive designer gowns, eagerly waiting to witness the glorious continuation of the sacred Sterling bloodline. At the front of the massive ballroom, standing beneath an archway woven with imported silk and white diamonds, stood DeAndre Sterling. He looked incredibly smug, projecting the false confidence of a man who believed he had successfully outsmarted destiny. Beside him stood Sabrina Davenport. She was draped in a custom haute couture wedding gown that cost more than most people earned in a decade. The dress was strategically tailored to aggressively highlight her 5-month pregnancy. She stood at the altar constantly rubbing her swollen belly with a heavily manicured hand, projecting a theatrical display of maternal triumph for the entire congregation to witness. She wanted every single billionaire and church elder in that room to know that she was the ultimate prize, the fertile heiress who had secured the prestigious sterling legacy. Bishop Calvin stood at the ornate marble podium, wearing his most holy, deeply sanctimonious expression. He was bathing in the glorious, unearned adoration of his wealthy peers, entirely convinced that his crumbling empire was finally secure. He had absolutely no idea that the foundation of his entire world was about to violently collapse. I checked my reflection one final time in the gilded mirror of the mezzanine lobby. I was not wearing the soft, modest pastels that the Sterling family had always forced me to wear. I was draped in a breathtaking custom-designed crimson silk gown that hugged every curve of my body and pooled like liquid fire around my heels. It was a dress engineered for absolute dominance, a blinding splash of power meant to completely desecrate their pristine, perfectly white aesthetic. But I was not walking into this battlefield alone. I reached down and gently took the small, warm hand of my son. Little Malik looked absolutely magnificent. He was dressed in a flawless, custom-tailored black tuxedo, complete with a tiny silk bow tie and polished dress shoes. He was perfectly calm, his large brown eyes taking in the grand surroundings with the exact same quiet, analytical intelligence that I possessed. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling an immense wave of fierce, predatory energy surge through my veins. Down below the soft string quartet faded into a reverent silence. Bishop Calvin's booming authoritative voice echoed through the massive ballroom, amplified by the state-of-the-art sound system I now technically owned. He launched into a lengthy, highly hypocritical sermon about the divine sanctity of truth, the sacred duty of building a righteous family legacy, and the absolute purity of the union they were celebrating today. The sheer audacity of his lies would have been infuriating if I did not already hold the ultimate winning hand. I listened closely as he approached the traditional mandatory culmination of the ceremony. His voice dropped to a dramatic, heavily practiced register. He asked the congregation if anyone present had any lawful reason why these two individuals should not be joined in holy matrimony. He instructed them to speak now or forever hold their peace. He paused, a smug, completely satisfied smile resting on his face, fully expecting the absolute silence of total victory. Instead of silence, he got me. I gave a sharp, precise nod to the head of my security detail stationed by the main entrance. The two massive, solid mahogany doors at the back of the grand ballroom were violently thrust open. The heavy wood slammed against the marble walls with a thunderous, echoing crash that instantly shattered the quiet reverence of the room. Every single head in the diamond ballroom snapped toward the entrance simultaneously. 500 members of the Atlanta elite turned in their plush velvet chairs, expecting to see a late-arriving billionaire or a confused hotel guest. What they saw instead completely paralyzed the entire room. I stepped directly into the center of the pristine white aisle, the vibrant crimson silk of my gown practically glowing against the stark, colorless background of their fraudulent fairy tale. I stood tall, my posture immaculate, projecting the terrifying, unshakable authority of a queen stepping back into her stolen kingdom. And holding my right hand, stepping bravely into the bright, blinding lights of the chandeliers, was Malik. The physical resemblance was not merely striking. It was an absolute, undeniable biological copy. As we stepped into the brilliant illumination of the aisle, the high society crowd got a clear, unobstructed view of the toddler holding my hand. Malik possessed DeAndre Sterling's exact piercing, deep brown eyes. He had the exact same distinct, slightly arched slope of the Sterling nose. He carried the identical sharp, arrogant structure of the Sterling jawline. It was as if someone had taken a photograph of DeAndre from his own childhood and brought it directly into the present moment. There was absolutely no room for debate, no margin for error, and no possible alternative explanation. The reaction was immediate and highly contagious. A shockwave of panicked, frantic whispers instantly ripped through the crowded pews. The influential megachurch elders sitting in the front rows leaned forward, their eyes wide with profound, highly scandalous realization. The billionaire real estate investors seated behind them began muttering rapidly to their wives, pointing discreetly at the tiny, perfectly dressed boy walking beside me. The carefully constructed, completely fabricated narrative that the Sterlings had spent 2 years aggressively selling to this elite crowd evaporated into thin air the very second Malik stepped onto the white silk runner. The congregation had been explicitly told that I was a barren, defective woman who had been tragically, but necessarily left behind. Now they were staring directly at living, breathing, undeniable proof that the Sterling family had orchestrated a massive foundational lie. At the front of the ballroom, the meticulously planned illusion of the perfect high society wedding violently imploded. DeAndre Sterling physically staggered backward, his expensive designer shoes slipping awkwardly against the polished marble steps of the altar. His face drained of all color, transforming into a sickly, terrified shade of gray. The heavy, gold-embossed vow book he had been holding in his trembling hands slipped from his grasp. It hit the marble floor with a loud, sharp thud that echoed clearly over the frantic, escalating whispers of the congregation. He stared at Malik with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror, his mind desperately trying to calculate the catastrophic impossibility standing right in front of him, beside him. Sabrina Davenport completely froze. Her hand stopped rubbing her 5-month baby bump, her fingers curling rigidly against the expensive silk of her maternity wedding gown. She looked from DeAndre to me, and then down to the toddler, holding my hand, her heavily contoured face twisting into a mask of total, absolute confusion that was rapidly morphing into profound terror. Kendra Sterling, who was standing at the altar as Sabrina maid of honor, looked as though she had just seen a ghost. The smug, condescending smile she constantly wore was entirely wiped from her face. She dropped her designer bouquet of white roses, the petals scattering across the marble steps, like the shattered remains of their family dignity. Kendra stared at me, then down at my son, her eyes darting frantically toward her father as she realized the magnitude of the lie they had all participated in. She had personally dragged my suitcases down the stairs and proudly bragged about bringing Sabrina into their lives. Now she was forcefully pinned under the paralyzing weight of public exposure, completely unable to escape the judging stares of the wealthiest families in Atlanta. But it was Bishop Calvin whose reaction was the most spectacular. The powerful, untouchable leader of the Atlanta megachurch literally choked on his own breath. He gripped the edges of the ornate marble podium so tightly that his knuckles turned completely white. His jaw dropped open, exposing his sheer, unfiltered panic. The holy, righteous mask he wore for his congregation had been completely ripped away, leaving only a desperate, ruined man staring down the barrel of his own destruction. The tension in the ballroom escalated to a fever pitch. The heavy scent of the imported floral arrangements suddenly felt suffocating as the collective anxiety of 500 guests filled the enclosed space. Church elders began turning aggressively toward one another, their hushed tones carrying sharp, indignant questions about the integrity of their spiritual leader. Wealthy socialites, who had previously offered me fake pitying smiles, were now covering their mouths in sheer disbelief, completely engrossed by the spectacular scandal unfolding before their very eyes. They had come to celebrate a flawless union between two powerful dynasties. Instead, they were receiving front-row tickets to the most explosive, highly anticipated social demolition the city had ever witnessed. I tightened my gentle grip on Malik's tiny hand, ensuring he felt entirely safe and protected amidst the growing chaos. He babbled softly, completely unfazed by the hundreds of staring faces, his innocent presence acting as the most devastating, undeniable weapon I could have ever brandished. I did not rush. I did not raise my voice. I simply began to walk. I moved slowly and confidently down the center of the white silk aisle, my crimson gown sweeping gracefully across the floor. My heels clicked a slow, rhythmic, terrifying countdown against the marble, echoing the impending doom of their fraudulent empire. The elite crowd parted slightly, leaning away from the aisle as if my sheer presence carried an electric charge. I kept my chin perfectly level, my eyes locked dead onto the terrified face of Bishop Calvin Sterling. The trap had been fully sprung, the audience was entirely captivated, and I was finally ready to deliver the fatal blow to the Sterling family legacy. Bishop Calvin Sterling was a man intimately accustomed to absolute obedience. For 3 decades, he had ruthlessly ruled his sprawling megachurch empire with an iron fist, dictating the finances and moral compasses of thousands of trusting followers. He had never been publicly challenged, let alone humiliated before Atlanta's wealthiest power players. It took exactly 10 agonizing seconds for his initial paralyzing shock to wear off, replaced by a sudden surge of tyrannical rage. The holy facade he wore perfectly vanished, revealing the ruthless cornered narcissist hiding underneath the expensive religious robes. Calvin's face morphed from a terrified ash into a deep, furious crimson. He stepped aggressively away from the ornate marble podium, his heavy vestments sweeping violently around his ankles. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. He did not care that he was standing in front of billionaire real estate tycoons and elite local politicians. He only cared about regaining control of his crumbling narrative. His voice, usually reserved for smooth, highly charismatic Sunday sermons, cracked into a frantic authoritarian roar that echoed violently across the diamond ballroom. He commanded the security team to intervene immediately. He screamed that I was a deranged ex-fiancé attempting to ruin a sacred holy union. He demanded I be removed from the premises, labeling me a hostile trespasser and a dangerous threat to his pristine family. Sabrina eagerly joined the desperate chorus. She clutched her baby bump and shrieked at the bewildered groomsmen to do something, demanding someone drag me out of her perfect wedding. DeAndre remained entirely frozen, his eyes locked onto Malik, completely incapable of functioning as a protector. Calvin furiously waved his heavy hands at the towering double doors, roaring for the hotel guards to seize me and the child without delay. He puffed out his chest, attempting to aggressively project the untouchable alpha dominance he had always used to intimidate his congregation. He fully expected to watch me dragged out in absolute disgrace, weeping and defeated. He had no idea how drastically the ultimate power dynamic had shifted. At the back of the ballroom, the heavy polished mahogany doors swung open even wider. The Sovereign Grand Hotel's director of security, a towering, fiercely imposing man named Marcus, marched purposefully down the center of the pristine white silk aisle. He was flanked by 4 heavily muscled, sharply dressed security agents wearing communication earpieces. The intimidating thud of their synchronized footsteps cut cleanly through the frantic, escalating murmurs of the elite congregation. Bishop Calvin immediately puffed out his chest even further, a deeply arrogant, victorious smirk returning to his flushed, sweaty face. He confidently assumed his aggressive pastoral commands had successfully activated the hotel's elite emergency protocols. He pointed his finger at me again, loudly instructing Marcus to confiscate my phone, seize the toddler from my grip, and physically throw me out onto the hot Atlanta street. The entire luxurious ballroom held its collective breath, anticipating a highly public physical altercation. Wealthy socialites nervously clutched their diamond necklaces, and influential church elders leaned forward in their plush velvet chairs, eager to watch the supposed interloper be brutally punished for daring to disrupt the untouchable Sterling dynasty. But Marcus did not break into a run. He did not unholster his radio, and he certainly did not reach out to aggressively grab my arms. He marched directly up to where I stood in the exact center of the aisle, perfectly positioned beneath the glittering, cascading crystal chandeliers. He came to an abrupt, highly disciplined halt, exactly 2 feet in front of me. He completely ignored Calvin's furious, escalating shouts from the altar. Marcus deliberately turned his broad back to the Sterling family, effectively shielding little Malik and me from their aggressive, pathetic posturing. Then, in a breathtaking display of absolute deference that caused a collective gasp to ripple wildly through the wealthy congregation, the towering head of security respectfully bowed his head to me. He clasped his large hands professionally behind his back, his deep voice projecting clearly in the sudden, stunned silence of the room. He addressed me with utmost corporate reverence, asking if the current security arrangements were satisfactory and if I required any immediate forceful assistance with the highly disruptive individuals currently screaming at the altar. The absolute loyalty in his professional posture was completely undeniable. Calvin completely lost his mind. The thick vein in his neck bulged dangerously against his starched white collar. He lunged forward, aggressively grabbing the microphone from the marble podium, his booming voice dripping with unhinged, frantic indignation. He screamed directly at Marcus, threatening to have him fired immediately, demanding to speak to the general manager, and loudly vowing to utterly destroy the hotel's pristine reputation for allowing a deranged trespasser to dictate orders to the hospitality staff. He was a desperate, drowning man, fiercely fighting against a massive corporate current he could not even begin to comprehend. Right on cue, the Sovereign Grand Hotel's general manager, an impeccably dressed industry veteran named Mr. Hayes, stepped smoothly from the shadows of the side corridor. He walked onto the raised altar with measured steps, standing directly between the furious, sweating bishop and the completely paralyzed groom. The manager did not look remotely intimidated by Calvin's religious title or his empty, pathetic threats of financial ruin. He casually adjusted his tailored suit jacket, calmly reached out, and firmly took the microphone directly out of the bishop's trembling hand. The sharp sound of audio feedback whined briefly before the manager's smooth, highly professional voice echoed through the diamond ballroom, commanding the attention of every single billionaire, politician, and elite socialite in the room. He turned to face Calvin, offering a polite, icy corporate smile that contained absolutely no genuine warmth. He apologized to the bishop for the sudden, unexpected interruption to the holy ceremony. Then, with a chilling, devastating clarity that permanently severed the final fragile thread of the Sterling family's fabricated reality, he delivered the fatal blow. He announced that the hotel security team could not and would not remove me from the premises under any circumstances. He stated, his voice ringing with absolute unyielding finality, that they possessed zero legal authority to eject the sole owner of the property. He formally informed the stunned, breathless congregation that my parent corporation had successfully completed a massive, all-cash acquisition of the Sovereign Grand Hotel earlier this week. The general manager turned his back on Calvin and bowed respectfully in my direction, publicly cementing my absolute, undeniable authority over the building, the staff, and the very ground the Sterlings were standing on. The profound, deafening silence that abruptly crashed over the grand ballroom was heavier than solid concrete. It was the terrifying quiet of an entire social hierarchy, violently imploding in real time. 500 members of Atlanta's elite society sat completely paralyzed in their plush velvet chairs, desperately trying to process the catastrophic power reversal. The wealthy congregation collectively realized I was not a bitter, discarded ex-fiancé seeking pathetic closure. I was a ruthless corporate titan who had successfully executed the most brilliant hostile takeover in the city. I watched the horrifying realization slowly wash over Bishop Calvin's face. His arrogant demeanor completely evaporated, replaced by deep, sickening terror as his eyes darted wildly around the lavish venue. He looked up at the thousands of imported white orchids hanging from the ceiling. He looked at the towering champagne pyramids, the extravagant crystal decor, and the army of catering staff standing at attention. The crushing, undeniable truth finally clicked into place in his greedy mind. They were standing directly on my private property. They were drinking my imported champagne. They had aggressively spent millions of dollars of their secret bailout money to fund a fraudulent high society wedding directly inside my house. They were entirely at my absolute mercy, securely trapped inside a beautifully decorated cage I had meticulously designed for their ultimate public execution. Sabrina let out a strangled sob, backing away from the altar, as the horrifying reality of her ruined fairy tale truly set in. Kendra covered her mouth with trembling hands, shrinking cowardly into the shadows of the bridesmaid lineup. DeAndre finally tore his eyes away from Malik and looked directly at me. The weak man who had callously thrown me away in a sweltering parking lot now stared at me with pure, unfiltered dread. He recognized the cold, unyielding determination shining in my eyes. He knew I had not come to simply stop the wedding. I had come to permanently destroy his life. I released Malik's tiny hand, signaling for my executive assistant to safely guide my son away from the impending blast zone. I walked gracefully up the marble steps of the altar. The Sterling family shrank back, parting like the Red Sea. I stepped up to a stunned groomsman, smoothly pulled his wireless microphone from his hand, and turned to face the captivated audience. The trap had snapped shut, and I was holding the only key. I stood firmly on the steps of the grand altar, holding the hijacked microphone with absolute authority. The silence inside the diamond ballroom was suffocating heavy with the terror of 500 paralyzed members of elite Atlanta society. Billionaire developers, influential politicians, and the conservative elders of Bishop Calvin Sterling's congregation held their breath. Their eyes darted wildly between my crimson gown and the pale faces of the groom's family. Calvin gripped the polished wooden podium, his jaw slack with horror. DeAndre looked as though the floor had vanished beneath his designer shoes, trembling violently. Sabrina clutched her swollen belly, her face twisted into a mask of pure confusion. Kendra shrank against a floral archway, desperately trying to disappear. I did not yell. I spoke with a lethal calm that commanded the entire room. I raised my hand and delivered a sharp signal to my technical team inside the audiovisual booth at the back of the ballroom. The massive screens positioned directly behind the altar had originally been programmed to play a curated romanticized slideshow of DeAndre and Sabrina's fraudulent courtship. The instant my hand dropped, the elegant gold wedding monogram abruptly flickered and vanished into total blackness. The soft string quartet music was instantly cut off, leaving behind a deafening silence. In their place, stark clinical hospital documents suddenly illuminated the grand space in a harsh white light. The sheer size of the projection screens made the bold black text impossible for anyone in the congregation to ignore. I turned my body slightly, gesturing with a hand toward the glowing digital displays. I looked directly into the sea of wealthy, captivated faces and announced that, before they blindly celebrated the glorious continuation of the sacred Sterling legacy, they must first examine its rotting foundation. I began to methodically walk the elite crowd through the exact, undeniable medical truth. The first document displayed on the screens was an authenticated pathology report bearing the official letterhead of Doctor Harrison Wallace's exclusive Buckhead fertility clinic. My voice echoed through the sound system as I read the fabricated diagnosis aloud for the entire congregation to hear. Premature ovarian failure. Complete irreversible infertility. I explained, my tone cutting through the air. How I sat in that freezing office 2 years ago and listened as the respected specialist declared my biological worth to be absolutely zero. I pointed my finger directly at DeAndre, whose face had turned a shade of gray. I described the exact moment my fiancé dropped my hand in disgust. I recounted how he abandoned me in the sweltering parking lot, demanded his ring back, and callously discarded our 3-year relationship simply because his father's powerful ministry required a highly fertile vessel to secure their elite bloodline. DeAndre shook his head, his chest heaving as he attempted to step forward and grab the microphone from my hands. But 2 hotel security guards immediately blocked his path, shoving him back against the cold marble steps of the altar. The billionaire real estate developers and wealthy socialites sitting in the front rows were completely transfixed, their eyes darting rapidly between the tragic medical documents on the screen and DeAndre's terrified, intensely guilty expression. I did not let them process the cruelty of his abandonment for too long. The momentum of my absolute vengeance required rapid, relentless escalation. I gave another precise signal to the audiovisual booth. The massive screens flashed blindingly once again, smoothly transitioning to a completely different set of official hospital records. These new documents boldly bore the undeniable seal of the prestigious Atlanta emergency room, where I had collapsed exactly 1 month after my brutal eviction. I projected my voice effortlessly, slicing cleanly through the rising, frantic murmurs of the wealthy crowd. I instructed the audience to look closely at the admission timestamps highlighted in neon yellow across the emergency room medical forms. I displayed the conclusive results of my comprehensive blood work and the initial abdominal ultrasound images. I read the emergency room doctor's official indisputable clinical conclusion clearly. I was perfectly healthy, my reproductive system was entirely flawless, and I was exactly 7 weeks pregnant. The biological math instantly clicked in the sharp minds of the 500 highly educated guests sitting in the velvet pews. A collective, extremely audible gasp ripped violently through the diamond ballroom. I looked dead into Bishop Calvin's widening bloodshot eyes and stated the absolute terrifying truth. The innocent child, Malik, who DeAndre abandoned me over, was already growing safely inside my womb on the exact day they threw me out. Sabrina Davenport let out a panicked sob, her hands gripping the delicate silk fabric of her expensive haute couture wedding gown, so tightly her knuckles turned bright white. She looked wildly at DeAndre, desperately demanding an immediate explanation, but DeAndre was completely speechless, his eyes securely locked onto the towering medical proof of his own catastrophic mistake. I continued my relentless, perfectly calculated assault, my voice entirely devoid of any mercy or pity. I asked the stunned, breathless room a simple, devastating, highly logical question. Why would a renowned, highly expensive fertility specialist deliberately lie to a perfectly healthy woman? Why would an elite medical professional risk his lucrative career to fabricate a devastating diagnosis of premature ovarian failure? I answered my own rhetorical question by signaling the audiovisual booth for the third time. The clinical medical files instantly vanished from the screens, rapidly replaced by a classified bank wire transfer document. The illegal financial document was projected in massive, inescapable detail across the towering altar screens for every single guest to scrutinize. I walked the horrified, silent congregation through the sickening, undeniable financial trail. I deliberately highlighted the origin account listed on the wire transfer. The money did not come from Bishop Calvin's personal savings or private investments. The funds were wired directly from the Sterling Megachurch Sacred Charity Fund, a strictly regulated bank account, supposedly reserved entirely for community outreach, local youth programs, and impoverished international missions. I then highlighted the destination account, an offshore, completely untraceable corporate shell account directly registered to none other than Doctor Harrison Wallace. The wire transfer was for exactly $100,000. The processing date of the illicit transaction was highlighted in glaring red ink. The massive bribe was processed and officially cleared exactly 3 days before I received my fake life-ruining diagnosis. The financial revelation acted like a highly destructive bomb, detonating directly inside the luxurious ballroom. The influential megachurch elders, sitting in the pristine front pews, immediately jumped to their feet, their faces contorted with absolute, unadulterated righteous outrage. These were the exact men who had blindly trusted Bishop Calvin for decades. The highly successful men who had eagerly donated millions of their own personal wealth to fund his supposedly holy endeavors. I turned my razor-sharp focus directly onto the heavily sweating, violently trembling bishop. I did not hold back a single ounce of my righteous fury. I publicly exposed his sickening hypocrisy to the very people who eagerly signed his massive paychecks. I fiercely denounced the supposedly untouchable religious leader, revealing exactly how the great Bishop Calvin willingly embezzled sacred church funds meant for the poor and vulnerable. He brazenly stole from his own trusting congregation to aggressively bribe a corrupt medical professional. My carefully chosen words were precise, lethal strikes aimed directly at the heart of the Sterling Empire. I told the elite crowd exactly how Calvin deliberately orchestrated a devastating, highly illegal psychological assassination against a loyal, hard-working woman who had done absolutely nothing but support his family. He maliciously manipulated medical records, entirely shattered my reality, and violently ejected me from my own home with nothing but the clothes on my back. And he executed all of this highly illegal, deeply immoral maneuvering simply to protect the fragile, pathetic, dangerously insecure ego of his deeply flawed son. He desperately needed a clean, socially acceptable excuse to quickly discard me, so DeAndre could immediately marry into the Davenport family, billions, and ultimately save their sinking, heavily indebted megachurch from total financial ruin. I exposed their complete lack of morality, their sheer unbridled greed, and the devastating lengths they went to preserve their fake image. Bishop Calvin lunged toward the sharp edge of the marble altar, his face a horrifying mask of pure, desperate panic. He screamed at the absolute top of his lungs, his booming voice cracking under the intense strain of his public exposure. He desperately yelled to the furious church elders that the financial documents were expertly forged, that I was a vindictive, highly unstable woman executing an elaborate corporate smear campaign to destroy their holy mission. He fiercely denied the blatant embezzlement, claiming the offshore transfer was a completely legitimate charitable donation. But his frantic denials were completely useless. The elite crowd could clearly see the undeniable authenticity of the official banking seals and routing numbers. The church elders began shouting back at him, their voices echoing aggressively off the vaulted ceilings of the diamond ballroom. They demanded immediate answers, furiously demanding to know exactly how their sacred, hard-earned offerings had been maliciously funneled into a dirty offshore account. The pristine, holy illusion of the Sterling Empire was actively burning to the ground right in front of their eyes. The sheer volume of the outrage was deafening, a tidal wave of righteous fury crashing down on the corrupt bishop. But amidst the spectacular, highly public collapse of Calvin Sterling, another major player in this fraudulent charade decided to make a desperate, fatal move. Brianna Davenport simply could not handle the horrifying fact that her perfect multi-million-dollar high society wedding was being violently dismantled. She was a spoiled, fiercely entitled heiress who had spent her entire life getting exactly what she wanted whenever she wanted it, courtesy of her billionaire father's massive bank accounts. She absolutely refused to let a woman she considered far beneath her steal the spotlight and ruin her carefully orchestrated social triumph. Brianna stepped aggressively forward, inserting herself directly between the furious congregation and her completely paralyzed groom. Brianna smoothed the heavy imported silk of her custom haute couture maternity gown, deliberately drawing the entire room's attention to her protruding 5-month baby bump. She lifted her chin, her face heavily contoured and currently flushed with pure, unadulterated rage. She glared at me with absolute unfiltered hatred, completely ignoring the massive financial crimes that had just been exposed on the screens above her head. Brianna did not care about the embezzled church funds or the fabricated medical records. She only cared about maintaining her elite social status and firmly securing her prestigious position as the new untouchable matriarch of the Sterling dynasty. She forcefully grabbed a wireless microphone from the ornate marble podium, her shrill voice screeching terribly through the state-of-the-art sound system, slicing cleanly through the heavy, chaotic noise of the arguing congregation. She pointed a manicured, jewel-encrusted finger directly at my face and screamed that I was nothing but a bitter, deeply jealous, discarded ex-fiancée who simply could not handle being replaced by a superior woman. She fiercely rubbed her rounded stomach, a highly theatrical, aggressive display of her supposed fertility meant to put me in my place. She yelled that it did not matter if I had somehow managed to produce Donovan's bastard child in secret years ago. She proudly declared, her voice dripping with extreme arrogance, that she was standing at the holy altar as his chosen wife, and she was currently carrying his true, highly anticipated legitimate heir. Brianna haughtily announced that her father's billionaire real estate empire would officially merge with the Sterling legacy today, and my unwanted presence here was just a pathetic, desperate cry for attention from a woman who had already lost the war. She looked out at the wealthy crowd, aggressively demanding their loyalty, demanding they recognize her as the ultimate victor in this toxic triangle. She firmly believed that her pregnancy gave her absolute untouchable power over me and everyone else in the room. The diamond ballroom fell into a tense, breathless hush. The elite socialites and furious church elders turned their undivided attention back to me, waiting anxiously to see exactly how I would respond to the aggressive, humiliating taunts of the pregnant heiress. They fully expected me to argue defensively. They expected a massive, degrading, screaming match between the former fiancé and the new bride. They expected a trashy reality television spectacle. I gave them absolute chilling silence. I stood gracefully at the base of the marble altar, my posture immaculate, completely unaffected by her frantic, deeply insecure screaming. I did not raise my voice to defend my honor. I did not shout to defend the absolute legitimacy of my beautiful son. I simply looked up at Brianna Davenport with a slow, lethal, terrifying smile. It was the exact kind of smile an apex predator gives a trapped, oblivious animal just before the final deadly strike. The sheer, overwhelming confidence radiating from my calm expression caused Brianna's arrogant sneer to visibly falter. The heavy, suffocating realization that she had just blindly walked into another catastrophic trap began to slowly dawn on her heavily made-up face. I turned my head slightly and delivered one final precise hand signal to my technical team waiting eagerly in the audiovisual booth. The glowing digital screen suspended high behind the grand altar flickered instantly. The damning bank wire transfers and the fake fertility diagnoses vanished into total blackness. The congregation held its collective breath, anticipating the final blow. A brand new, highly classified medical document suddenly illuminated the massive displays, bathing the terrified wedding party in a harsh, unforgiving white light. This specific document was not printed on the letterhead of a corrupt, easily bribed fertility clinic. This was a completely different, highly secure pathology report generated by one of the most prestigious independent urology specialists in the entire state of Georgia. The official hospital seals were pristine and undeniable, the examination dates were clearly visible, and the patient name printed boldly at the top of the massive screen sent a colossal, paralyzing shockwave directly through the diamond ballroom. Donovan Sterling. I raised my microphone, my voice echoing with a dark, commanding clarity that forced every single person in the room to hang on to my every word. I instructed the elite audience to read the clinical diagnosis displayed on the towering screens. I did not rush the delivery. I enunciated every single medical term with devastating, surgical precision to ensure no one could misunderstand the magnitude of the revelation. I read the bold black text aloud for the entire high society congregation to hear. Patient Donovan Sterling. Diagnosis: advanced azoospermia. Sperm count absolutely zero. Condition 100% sterile. Status completely and totally irreversible. The heavy, terrifying weight of those specific medical terms crashed into the grand ballroom like a falling building. The silence that instantly followed was absolute and profound. It was a suffocating vacuum of sound where not a single person dared to breathe. The billionaire investors, the furious church elders, and the gossiping socialites were completely frozen in their velvet chairs, their eyes darting frantically between the massive medical report and the trembling ashen face of the groom standing at the altar. Donovan looked exactly like a man who had just been forcefully struck by lightning. His mouth hung open in a silent, horrified scream. He could not deny the official document looming behind him. He could not claim it was a forgery. He knew exactly what that pathology report was, and he knew exactly when he had received it. He had spent the last 2 years desperately hiding his severe biological inadequacy behind my fabricated infertility, playing the role of the tragic healthy man who simply wanted to build a family. Now his deepest, darkest, most shameful secret was permanently exposed in front of the most powerful people in Atlanta. I turned my body, my crimson silk gown shifting elegantly against the polished marble floor, and focused my razor-sharp gaze entirely on Brianna Davenport. The wealthy heiress was standing completely paralyzed at the altar, her manicured hands still resting aggressively on her 5-month baby bump. The arrogant, triumphant flush had completely drained from her face, leaving her looking sickly, terrified, and profoundly confused. I spoke directly to her, my tone laced with a cold, terrifying amusement. I told her that my beautiful son, Cairo, was an absolute medical miracle. I explained, detailing the exact timeline projected on the screen behind her, that Cairo was conceived during the very last incredibly narrow window of Donovan's declining fertility, right before his aggressive genetic condition became absolute and permanent. I took a slow, deliberate step up the marble stairs, closing the physical distance between us. I looked dead into Brianna's wide, panicking eyes. I made sure my voice carried to the very back rows of the massive ballroom, ensuring her billionaire father heard every single syllable of my next sentence clearly. I stated clearly that Donovan's pathology report was dated exactly 24 months ago. The leading medical specialists in the state had confirmed without a single shadow of a doubt that Donovan Sterling had been completely, entirely, and irreversibly sterile for exactly 2 full years. He was biologically incapable of producing a single living cell, let alone fathering another child. I paused for a brief second, letting the crushing, inescapable mathematical reality settle heavily over the altar. Brianna's chest began to heave violently as she struggled to pull oxygen into her lungs. The expensive diamond tiara resting in her perfectly styled hair seemed to mock the absolute devastation currently destroying her fairy tale wedding. I tilted my head, offering her a look of pure, unadulterated mock sympathy. I asked the final world-shattering question that would forever end the Sterling dynasty. "So, Brianna," I said, my voice dripping with lethal curiosity, "if Donovan has been completely 100% sterile for exactly 24 months, who exactly is the father of that 5-month-old baby currently growing in your belly?" The silence that answered my question was so profound, it felt as though the oxygen had been entirely sucked out of the diamond ballroom. 500 pairs of eyes shifted in perfect unison from my face directly to Brianna Davenport. The wealthy heiress stood frozen at the altar, her manicured hands physically trembling as they rested against the prominent curve of her maternity wedding gown. The smug, entitled arrogance that had defined her entire existence completely evaporated. She opened her mouth to speak, but absolutely no sound emerged. She simply gasped like a dying fish on dry land. Donovan physically stumbled away from his bride, as if the expensive imported silk of her dress had suddenly caught fire. The devastating mathematical reality of his irreversible sterility had finally penetrated his thick, fragile skull. He looked at the massive medical pathology report glowing brightly on the screens above, and then he looked down at the 5-month baby bump. His beautiful bride had been aggressively flaunting all afternoon. His face contorted into a mask of pure agony and profound betrayal. He pointed a shaking finger at Brianna, his voice cracking into a pathetic high-pitched whisper as he demanded to know the absolute truth. I desperately begged her to confirm that the projected medical documents were elaborate fakes, but Brianna could not even look him in the eye. Instead, entirely by deeply ingrained instinct, Brianna's terrified eyes darted directly past her groom, her gaze locked frantically onto a specific seat in the third row of the velvet pews. Sitting in that exact seat was a highly attractive muscled man wearing a slightly ill-fitting tuxedo. I instantly recognized him from the elite Buckhead social circles. How was Brianna's highly paid private personal fitness trainer? He had spent the last 2 years actively managing her daily workout routines at her father's exclusive country club. As Brianna's desperate, guilty eyes locked onto his, the handsome trainer physically slouched down in his chair. The blood completely drained from his face as he realized he was suddenly the central focus of a multi-million-dollar high society scandal. The visual confirmation was instantaneous and completely undeniable. Donovan followed her gaze directly to the muscular trainer sitting in the pews. The horrific realization hit him with the devastating force of a physical blow. The prestigious, highly anticipated legitimate sterling heir that had been meticulously designed to save his father's crumbling religious empire was nothing but a cheap, dirty lie. Donovan had thrown away a loyal woman and abandoned his only actual biological son to willingly step into a fraudulent marriage with a woman who was actively carrying another man's child. He let out a gut-wrenching, deeply pathetic wail of pure humiliation. He clutched his perfectly styled hair and dropped to his knees right there on the pristine marble steps of the altar. The supposedly untouchable golden child of Atlanta was publicly reduced to a weeping, broken shell. The sheer chaos that erupted inside the ballroom immediately following his collapse was absolutely spectacular. It was the glorious sound of a massive, heavily fortified social hierarchy violently tearing itself to shreds. The polite whispers of the Atlanta elite instantly transformed into furious, unrestrained shouts. Wealthy socialites aggressively grabbed their phones, frantically texting the explosive details of the scandal to everyone in their contact lists. But the most explosive reaction came directly from the front row, where Brianna's father, the ruthless billionaire real estate mogul, Marcus Davenport, was currently turning a deep, dangerous shade of purple. Marcus Davenport built his entire billionaire legacy on absolute control and fierce, uncompromising dominance. He had enthusiastically poured millions of dollars into this extravagant high society wedding, convinced he was aligning his secular real estate empire with the untouchable prestige of the Sterling megachurch. He had blindly trusted Bishop Calvin Sterling, Now, standing in the chaotic diamond ballroom, he realized he had been played for a complete fool. The Sterlings were deeply indebted, morally bankrupt frauds who had aggressively conspired to use his daughter's bank accounts to secretly bail out their failing church. Worse still, his own daughter had publicly disgraced their elite family name by attempting to pass off a personal trainer's child as a billionaire heir. Marcus let out a furious, deafening roar that completely overpowered the rising noise of the chaotic crowd. He did not care about the hundreds of cell phone cameras currently recording his every move. He charged directly up the marble steps of the grand altar, his fists tightly clenched at his sides. He completely ignored his weeping daughter and bypassed the broken kneeling groom. He aimed his violent billionaire rage directly at the man who had orchestrated the entire fraudulent merger. Bishop Calvin had barely recovered from the devastating exposure of his illegal medical bribes when the furious real estate mogul aggressively lunged at him. Marcus grabbed the front of Calvin's heavily embroidered pastoral robes, physically lifting the corrupt religious leader up onto his toes. He screamed violently into Calvin's face, promising to completely annihilate the Sterling family. He vowed to unleash an army of corporate lawyers to seize every single remaining asset the church possessed. He swore to personally ensure that Calvin spent the remainder of his pathetic, fraudulent life rotting inside a federal prison cell for gross financial extortion. Calvin desperately tried to pry the billionaire's heavy hands off his sacred garments, sputtering frantic apologies and pleading for a private negotiation. The undignified struggle quickly escalated into a highly physical, chaotic brawl right in front of the massive glowing screens, displaying the undeniable evidence of their corruption. 6 muscular groomsmen, terrified by the sudden violence, urgently rushed the altar. They frantically grabbed Marcus by his shoulders, struggling aggressively to physically separate the furious billionaire from the heavily sweating bishop. The pristine custom-imported white floral arrangements were violently knocked over during the intense struggle, scattering thousands of crushed petals across the marble floor like debris from a detonated bomb. As the groomsmen finally managed to pull the raging real estate mogul away, a new wave of destruction washed over the disgraced bishop. The highly influential elders of the Sterling megachurch, the exact men who held the ultimate financial control over the entire religious organization, stood up in perfect unified precision. These were deeply conservative, fiercely protective men who had dedicated their wealth to building the church's pristine reputation. They had watched in absolute horror as their supposed spiritual leader was publicly exposed as a manipulative, embezzling fraud who routinely stole from their sacred charity funds to orchestrate malicious, highly illegal medical cover-ups. The lead elder, a towering, deeply respected judge in the Atlanta community, stepped firmly out of the front pew. He did not shout. He did not engage in the trashy physical violence of the billionaire mogul. He spoke with a chilling, absolute authority that immediately commanded the silent attention of the entire frantic ballroom. He pointed a steady, unwavering finger directly at Bishop Calvin, who was currently straightening his torn pastoral robes with trembling hands. The lead elder loudly declared, his voice ringing with pure righteous condemnation, that Calvin Sterling was completely and immediately stripped of his sacred title. He announced to the massive congregation that the church board was officially freezing all administrative bank accounts and launching a comprehensive independent forensic audit of the entire religious organization. He stated that Calvin was permanently excommunicated from the megachurch he had built, banned from ever stepping foot on their sacred properties again. He promised the elite crowd that the board would eagerly cooperate with any federal investigations regarding the embezzled charity funds and illegal offshore wire transfers. Bishop Calvin physically crumpled under the crushing weight of the elder's absolute decree. His legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed heavily against the ornate marble podium, his face buried in his trembling hands. The untouchable leader of the Atlanta megachurch was officially dead, replaced by a ruined, pathetic criminal awaiting inevitable federal prosecution. In a matter of 10 explosive minutes, the untouchable Sterling dynasty had been completely erased from the face of Atlanta's elite society. Donovan had lost his wealthy bride, his fake heir, and every single shred of his masculine dignity. He was kneeling on the cold marble floor, a broken, publicly humiliated coward. Bishop Calvin had lost his sprawling religious empire, his massive hidden wealth, and his carefully curated holy reputation. He was a disgraced, deeply indebted fraud who would spend the rest of his miserable life drowning in aggressive federal lawsuits and crippling financial ruin. They had aggressively sought to destroy me simply because they believed I was a disposable, worthless peasant who lacked the power to fight back. They had fundamentally misunderstood the dangerous, relentless resilience of a woman who builds her own empire from the ground up. The destruction was comprehensive, absolute, and profoundly satisfying. The Sterling Empire was dead, and I was the reigning queen standing fiercely victorious over its ashes. The reality of their absolute, unmitigated ruin finally shattered the last remaining fragments of Calvin and Donovan's arrogance. Stripped of his pastoral authority and facing imminent federal prosecution, the disgraced bishop suddenly realized that the tiny boy standing safely behind my security detail was the only valuable asset he had left in this world. Cairo was the sole biological continuation of the sacred Sterling name. He was their only remaining connection to actual, undeniable generational wealth. The shift from arrogant tyrants to pathetic, sniveling cowards was instantaneous and deeply revolting. Donovan, his face smeared with cold sweat and desperate tears, physically scrambled across the ruined white silk aisle, completely ignoring his weeping, publicly humiliated bride. He threw himself to his knees at the bottom of the marble steps, reaching his trembling hands out toward me. Bishop Calvin immediately followed, dropping his heavy torn robes onto the flour-crushed floor, crawling desperately like a beggar seeking salvation. Donovan wept openly on the floor, his voice a hoarse, pathetic, desperate whine as he frantically begged for my forgiveness. He pleaded that we were meant to be together, that he had made a terrible, misguided mistake under his father's pressure. He pointed a shaking finger toward the back of the room where my assistant held my son. He screamed that Cairo was a Sterling, his legitimate son, and that they were his true family. He promised he would leave Brianna immediately, claiming she meant absolutely nothing to him. Bishop Calvin aggressively echoed the desperate sentiment, clasping his sweaty hands together in a twisted, sickening display of fake prayer, begging me to remember the holy bonds of family and grant them the mercy they so desperately required. I did not flinch. I did not offer them a single ounce of the mercy they had violently denied me 2 years ago in that sweltering parking lot. I simply stood tall and stared down at the two broken kneeling men with absolute freezing contempt. I reached deep into my custom crimson clutch and slowly withdrew a single perfectly folded piece of heavy legal paper. It was not a medical file or a bank statement. It was the final notarized page of the Apex Holdings commercial real estate buyout agreement. I held the crisp document up, ensuring the bright ballroom chandeliers illuminated their distinct, arrogant signatures, resting clearly at the bottom of the page. I looked directly into Bishop Calvin's desperate, bloodshot eyes and reminded him of his own insatiable greed. I asked him if he remembered signing a highly expedited multi-million-dollar real estate contract to save his failing bankrupt church exactly 24 months ago. I watched his face drain of all remaining color as I loudly, methodically read the specific buried fine print to the captivated audience. I announced that by accepting my cash bailout, both Calvin and Donovan Sterling had legally, irrevocably, and permanently relinquished any and all paternal, familial, and financial rights to my child. I stated with devastating clarity that they had willingly sold their sacred, highly coveted bloodline for the exact price of a failing downtown commercial lot. They had absolutely no legal claim to Cairo. They had zero rights to my wealth. They were completely, permanently severed from our lives by their own desperate, greedy hands. The horrifying realization of their own monumental stupidity finally crushed the last breath out of their lungs. Donovan collapsed completely against the cold marble, sobbing uncontrollably into his hands as the weight of his permanent failure settled over him. Bishop Calvin remained frozen on his knees, a hollow, ruined shell of a man, staring blankly at the ironclad legal document that sealed his absolute destruction. I folded the contract and slipped it back into my clutch. I looked down at the men who had maliciously tried to destroy my future. I kept my voice perfectly level, letting the pristine acoustics of the grand ballroom carry my final decree to every billionaire politician and disgraced church elder in attendance. You called me a worthless barren woman, I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence like a diamond blade. Now you are the ones with absolutely nothing. Your entire legacy is nothing but dust and lies. I turned my back on the pathetic, miserable ruins of the Sterling dynasty. My security team immediately stepped forward, creating an impenetrable, protective wall behind me. I walked gracefully to the back of the room, smiling brightly as I gently took Cairo's small, warm hand in mine. As we turned to walk down the center aisle toward the grand exit, the high society crowd did not whisper or point. Instead, they physically parted for me, stepping back respectfully into the velvet pews with absolute undeniable reverence. Flash forward, exactly 3 months into the bright, promising future. The Atlanta news cycle remains completely dominated by the spectacular implosion of the Sterling Empire. Both Calvin and Donovan are currently facing severe federal indictments for gross financial extortion, massive embezzlement, and widespread wire fraud. They are entirely bankrupt, socially exiled, and universally despised by the very congregation they once ruthlessly controlled. Meanwhile, I am standing on the sprawling, sunlit balcony of my new corporate penthouse, sipping premium imported tea while watching the sun rise beautifully over the Atlanta skyline. My company, Luxe Horizon, has successfully doubled its massive annual revenue, and my son is thriving in a secure life built on absolute truth and unyielding strength. I never had to lower my standards or engage in their trashy, toxic warfare. I simply utilized their own boundless, predictable arrogance to architect their flawless destruction. Have you ever had to walk away from a highly toxic environment and build your own empire from the ground up? How did you find the strength to recognize your absolute worth and let karma do the heavy lifting? Share your empowering stories in the comments section below, and do not forget to hit that like and subscribe button for more powerful journeys of absolute resilience and healing.